Hey, how's everybody doing? Hope you're having a fantastic day. So, back with a live stream. So I was just earlier perusing through a lot of the texts again because, as a shameless plug, I'm going through a series on the Immaculate Conception and St. Thomas's belief in the Immaculate Conception. A longer series than this, based on Father Norbert del Prado's work on the Immaculate Conception, St. Thomas, and Ineffabilis Deus, which shows that St. Thomas actually had a more congruent belief in the Immaculate Conception than even somebody like Blessed Scotus had when it comes to the definition of the Church. So I was perusing through. So if you want to become a patron and get access to that series, just kind of a shameless plug. But I was perusing through the texts, as I often do, that mention the sanctification of the Blessed Virgin. If you don't know about the term sanctification of the Blessed Virgin, basically that was medieval speak for when the Blessed Virgin went from a state of, having original sin, which we'll talk in a little bit of what this term original sin actually is going to mean for the medievals, going from a state of having original sin to going to a state of sanctity. So this language is used by Scotus, Thomas, Bonaventure, everyone's using this language of sanctification. So when I mention sanctification, that's what I mean. So there's this mention of the sanctification of the Blessed Virgin. And there's this question, okay, well, when was she sanctified? When did it happen? And I was reading through all of those texts. And I realized that there's one text which is basically like, it's a boss text. It's like the final boss text right there for those who want to say that St. Thomas denied the Immaculate Conception. Because this text is unequivocal on the one hand, if you understand the terms properly. And on the other hand, not only is it unequivocal, but also provides the context and terminology. It's like an interpretive key for interpreting the rest of St. Thomas. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background in order to help you understand what's going on, just kind of ease you in there. And then I want to read the text for you, and then go and explain them on the basis of those principles. And trust me, for a lot of you, it is just click. It'll just click at that point. And from then on, you will be able to, throughout your reading of St. Thomas, understand what he's getting at. Okay, and I won't keep up with the chat. Sorry about that. That makes me way too distracted, but I will answer any super chats just because they kind of forced me to answer your question. I know I say that in a bad way, like, forced to answer your question, but Okay, so there's kind of 4 points of prolegomena that we need to cover. So the first point is a bit of an explanation of medieval embryology. So in medieval embryology, there was a belief in what's called delayed ensoulment. So when it comes to delayed ensoulment, first you had the marital use, the parents engage in the marital use. There is a certain depositing of semen and its mixture with, they thought, menstrual blood. And then this mixture would form the body. But the body, they said, would not be disposed to receive the soul, because as we know, the body comes from the parents. The soul immediately comes from God. So you'd have this time of maturing of the body of the child over time until it was disposed to receive the soul at some unknown period. There were some who speculated about different times in which animation happened for for boys versus girls, and so on. But really, this was an unknown timing. They didn't really know when this happened, when animation happened. So in animation, you had a mature body that was disposed to receive a soul, and then the rational soul was infused by God directly. Notice, infused by God directly into the soul. Okay, that's what you need to know about embryology. So the first one, it's important. The first one is called conception. Second one is sometimes also called conception, but it's usually called animation, and then some translate it as ensoulment. So animation or ensoulment versus conception. Those two are going to be very important. So in a regular conception, how would original sin be transmitted? And I think actually the strength behind this explanation of a distinction between conception and ensoulment was that it very helpfully explains the way in which original sin is communicated. It gives us a better understanding, although I don't think one necessarily needs to put time between the two, or at least a long time between the two in order to explain it well. So what we have for original sin is the proximate means of placing the child in what's called the seminal ratio of Adam. So you have to be somehow naturally included in Adam. So there's a stage in which you're naturally included. Has to happen through the concupiscence, so through the disorder of the marital act in the parents. Because concupiscence, which is said to be the material element of sin, is something which is material. This is going to be important in a second. So the concupiscence in the marital act is communicated in the depositing of the semen, and also the giving of the menstrual blood as well, according to them. So in the formation of the body, something material is being passed on, what's called the fomus peccati, the tinders of sin, so-called. And it's something which is said to be the proximate means of the inclusion in Adam. Why is this the case? Well, as we talked about earlier, we believe in immediate ensoulment. So how is the soul, how is the child supposed to have original sin? Well, obviously it has to be some sort of material transportation, if you will, not some sort of immaterial transportation, because God obviously isn't going to, shake up the soul and make it all defective and then give it to you. That would be evil for him to do. Rather, it has to flow from the material principle, that is the body. It has to flow from the body. And this obviously coming from the fomus peccati, from the concupiscence, which is communicated. So what happens is when the soul, which is pure in itself, comes into contact with the body, which has the fomus peccati, that forms a person. At animation is this time at which I'm speaking. So at animation, there's the formation of the person. And right there at that formation, the material element of original sin is there. That is the fomus peccati. But the formal element, that is a privation of grace, privation of original justice, that is not there yet. So the person is said to contract the necessity or the debt of original sin. That is debitum culpae originalis, the debt of original sin. So the person at this moment has the debt of original sin, but they don't actually have original sin. And the example that's usually given by St. Thomas, the one that I like, is basically how now, when we read throughout the New Testament, through the book of Romans, we see that death is an effect of the fall. But have I actually died yet? No. But do I still have this effect of the fall? Yes. Why? Because I have the debt of dying. I have a certain necessity of dying that I have in my body. So the debt of original sin is there in the person, and it's a personal debt. But then, after this, once one has the personal debt, if nature takes its course, actual original sin. And then the person is said to then be fallen. And they actually have contracted original sin. So, in order to affirm the Immaculate Conception, what does one in this sort of frame of thinking about original sin and the passing down of original sin and the development of the embryo, what would one need to believe in order to affirm the Immaculate Conception? So, there's a few ways in which one could do it. So we have first happens before first conception. Obviously, that's not happening. That's not happening. Because, and St. Thomas actually gives the reason in a sentences commentary. He says, well, because the complete elimination of concupiscence doesn't happen until glory. So the parents of the Blessed Virgin are not going to have this complete elimination of concupiscence yet. So then we have the era of the fomus peccati that happens after this conception. Can we affirm that of the Blessed Virgin? Yes, we can affirm that of the Blessed Virgin. I mean, even Scotus is going to affirm this of the Blessed Virgin. Okay, how about in animation in such a way as the soul is given this gift and never contracts the debt with the body? Well, I guess that's a possible way of thinking about it if one wanted to, but not even Blessed Scotus is going to admit this. What he's going to say is he's going to say, well, this debt needs to be something which is personal. It needs to be of the person. It can't be a sort of debt of a body before the soul comes into contact. So, in order to affirm the Immaculate Conception, we kind of have one choice left, and the choice is we cut right between, on the one hand, the debt of original sin, on the other hand, the actual contracting of original sin. By actual contracting, I mean the actual formal and material element, the privation of original justice that occurs. So that cutting right there is what one needs to do in order to, in this model, affirm the Immaculate Conception. What's important to note also is that the language of the medievals around the term original sin usually called everything from the beginning in the fomus peccati, in that communication, which is the proximate means of the inclusion in Adam, all the way to the personal debt of original sin. All of this is just phrased as original sin, as we'll see from the text. So it's not enough to say that after conception, one had original sin and was not cleansed after conception. It's not enough to say that. It's not enough even to say that the soul of the Blessed Virgin had original sin, since there's a personal debt of original sin. Rather, what one needs to show is that there's some sort of time. There's a time between the contraction of the debt of original sin that's personal to the Blessed Virgin. There's a time frame between that and animation. That's what one needs to affirm. I mean, not that in animation, that and the sanctification. That's what one needs to affirm. And if there's any sort of teaching from St. Thomas, I haven't seen any, but if you can enlighten me by finding some, I'd be happy to see it. If St. Thomas even hints that there is a period of time between the contraction of the personal debt of original sin and the sanctification, then he denies. If not, then he affirms. And the reason that I keep emphasizing Blessed Scotus, and I've been collecting texts on this, so I should have, maybe I'll put them in the, it's just kind of like a random collection of texts. But I can put them in the description or something. Maybe I'll put them in the description right now because I know I'll be asked like, oh, where are you referring to him? The reason I want to is kind of like a there you go. Oh, it's too long. Oh gosh. Let me see if I can somehow shorten this. Rip. I'll have to remove the section where it talks about a personal debitum in particular. Whatever. Okay, I don't think that took, but whatever. I was going to try to do it for you, but I couldn't. So that's all. The reason I keep emphasizing the Blessed Scotus is agreeing with these propositions of St. Thomas is because there's a certain prejudice against St. Thomas on this. A certain prejudice. But in order to affirm Ineffabilis Deus, all that somebody has to say is that there's not a single moment between the personal debt of original sin and the sanctification. There can be an order of nature. I think Blessed Scotus says there's an order of material cause, I think is his exact language. It can be an order of nature. There can't be an order of time. And that's what's important. Okay. So we have that. Now, the next point that's important in understanding what's going on, because now we've kind of set the grounds for embryology, set the grounds for how communication of original sin happens, set the grounds for what would constitute an affirmation of the Immaculate Conception. Now, what's the tinder? What's the sort of tinder that blew up, I guess you could say, and caused this dispute in the medievals? And where is the love? I don't know where the love is. That's so true, Big Steve. Where is the love? I hate that I have to answer questions like this. I'm sorry, Big Steve. I appreciate you very much. But now you got me off track, man. Okay. So what's the tinder? What caused this sort of explosion into this controversy around the conception of the Blessed Virgin? Well, who caused it? And the person that caused it was Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. So Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, there were certain churches, not the Church of Rome, and not many of the churches, but there were certain churches who started a new feast. What was this new feast? Well, the new feast was the feast of the conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And St. Bernard wrote a famous letter. I think it's his letter 174, 175, somewhere around there. It should be to the canons of Lyon. The feast was to celebrate the conception of Our Lady. Now, St. Bernard, his argumentation, it basically runs thus. So his argumentation is, we only celebrate feasts for that which is holy. And then he goes on to say, well, we celebrate feasts for the deaths of saints, because their deaths were holy, obviously. And even some special saints, such as the Blessed Virgin Mary, St. John the Baptist, and others, we celebrate their birth because they were sanctified in the womb. Like he brings up David and Jeremiah, were also sanctified in the womb. So he says, we celebrate the births of other saints, but it is unknown of, besides, I guess, Christ if we wanted to, although we kind of do that in Easter, although that's a story for a different day, but it's unknown of to celebrate anyone's conception. Why does he say that it's unknown of to celebrate anyone's conception? Well, he's going to say because the conception of all men besides Christ are tainted with original sin. That's what his argument was. And Scotus actually has an interesting interpretation of the patristic data on this, which is basically my same interpretation of St. Thomas, but that's kind of a story for a different day. But he says we can't celebrate the conception because the conception is unholy. Now, what does he mean by conception? So he says that the person doesn't exist. At this moment, which should kind of be telling. It says that the flesh can't be a subject of grace. It said it wouldn't include a redemption. It said it wouldn't have the universality of men falling from Adam. So to me, at least, it's pretty clear that he's actually talking about, and to the medievals after him, they interpret him as talking about first conception, or that initial conception of the body. Because if you think about it real quick with me. If you have a body without a soul, one, that's not a person, so there's no personal redemption. Two, there's no soul, and the soul is a subject of grace. And three, there can actually even be like a real contraction of original sin, but that's kind of different. So if you just have flesh without a soul, and that flesh is being redeemed, it's extremely unfitting. And all of the medievals, including Scotus, argued against this position, following St. Bernard of Clairvaux. So this specifically is the controversy which is being commented on. Specifically, the position which is being refuted was the position of the canons of Lyon, who thought that the conception of the Blessed Virgin was holy. Now, St. Thomas clarifies and slightly alters St. Bernard of Clairvaux's position in a very interesting way. And what we're going to see is this is the sort of perfect dagger in the heart of those who say that St. Thomas denies the Immaculate Conception. It's actually amazing how clear it is once you have all of what I've stated for this first 20 minutes in your mind. Okay, so this is Quod Libet 6, question 5, article 1, on the celebration of feasts. And then the question is, it seems that it is licit to celebrate the conception of Our Lady. He says, no, it is not. On the contrary, this privilege is said to belong to Christ alone, that he was conceived. Let's notice real quick. Okay, what is this privilege that belongs to Christ alone? That he is conceived without original sin. He's going to say in other places, the difference between the conception of the Blessed Virgin and the conception of Christ is that Christ didn't inherit his defects from Adam. Rather, Christ merely took flesh from the nature of Adam without the defects, but he assumed voluntarily those defects. That's the difference between the Blessed Virgin and Christ. The Blessed Virgin didn't assume defects. She received them from her parents. So this conception is talking about that first conception. It's not talking about animation. So St. Thomas can say all day that she was conceived with original sin, she was conceived with original sin, she was conceived with original sin. But if he doesn't mean animation, and he doesn't mean actual original sin, then this has nothing to do with the Immaculate Conception. Because remember, we talked about this earlier. This privilege is said to belong to Christ alone, that he was conceived without original sin. Therefore, it does not apply to the Blessed Virgin, and thus her conception is not to be celebrated. We'll see the reasoning where he actually does kind of allow it, slightly altering St. Bernard's position. Response. It must be said that here there are introduced two questions, one principal and the other accessory, namely whether the Blessed Virgin was conceived with original sin, and whether it is which is necessary to determine first. And then he's going to talk about the accessory one, which has to do with the celebration itself. It must be considered, therefore, that everyone contracts original sin from this. Okay, how do they contract original sin? That they were in Adam according to seminal ratio, as Augustine says in On the Literal Meaning of Genesis. Yet all those were in Adam according to seminal ratio, who not only received from him their flesh, but also were propagated from him according to the natural mode of origin. Okay, good. So we see here exactly why Christ doesn't have original sin in any sense. Why the Blessed Virgin, in one sense, has original sin. And that's because the Blessed Virgin not only received her flesh from Adam, as Christ also received his flesh from Adam, but also this was propagation, which is according to the natural mode of origin. Why does this matter that it was according to the natural mode of origin? I mentioned it earlier, but let's see. Yet the Blessed Virgin proceeded thus from Adam because she was born through the mingling of the sexes, just as the rest are. And thus she was conceived with original sin and included in their totality, concerning which the Apostle says, in whom all have sinned, from which totality only Christ is accepted, who is not found in Adam according to the seminal ratio. Why is this important? This is important because the Fomus Peccati said the tinders of sin, which are the proximate means of bringing about original sin in the soul, which forms the debt when the soul comes, when the person is formed, and eventually from this debt flows the necessity of contracting. This is something which is material. It's something which flows from the concupiscence in the act of the parents. So because of the effect of the original sin, every child is conceived and receives flesh which is tainted by concupiscence, and thus included in Adam according to the seminal ratio. So this is very important right here, because all that's being discussed so far is the conception, is the receiving of a certain body. It's all that's being discussed so far. He'll make it clear later. Otherwise, if this should accord with someone other than Christ, he would not need the redemption of Christ. So why wouldn't that other person need the redemption of Christ in that way? Well, the reason is that redemption is from something where there is at least in a certain sense, a privation. There's a loss which needs to be brought back. So St. Thomas would say there would need to be a reintegrating of nature, or the parents would somehow need to be glorified before the use because of the universal effects of concupiscence. So that's his reasoning behind this. For this reason, we ought not to give so much honor to the mother that something is subtracted from the honor of the Son, who is the Savior of all men, as the Apostle says. Now continuing. Yet, although the Blessed Virgin was conceived in original sin, nevertheless, it is believed that she had been sanctified in the womb before being born. So we have these three moments being stated. We have conception right here. So this is the formation of the body, sanctification, and then birth. So if this sanctification, we know it doesn't happen before animation, because he denies that later. And we know that it can only happen in two other instances. It can either happen in the same moment as the animation, so immediately after the animation, or it can happen with some lapse after animation. If there's some lapse, then St. Thomas denies the Immaculate Conception. So we're in a tough position here. Is he gonna cut the Gordian knot right here? We'll see that he does. And for this reason, the diverse custom of the Church has grown up about the celebration of her conception. For the Roman Church and most others, considering that the celebration of this same Virgin was the conception of the same Virgin was an original sin, do not celebrate the feast of her conception. And then notice this is where it gets good. Whereas some, considering her sanctification in the womb, the time of which is unknown, celebrate the conception. Oh no, we're done, guys. It's game over. He said that the time is unknown, and he says this in multiple places. The time of the sanctification is unknown. So this must mean that he didn't know whether the Immaculate Conception was true or not. I mean, that's slightly better than denying it, right? He just didn't know. Slightly better than denying. Well, let's see the next clause. For it is believed that immediately, notice, immediately after conception and the infusion of the soul, notice, conception is being distinguished from the infusion of the soul. So after both the bringing about of the body and the bringing out of the soul, she was sanctified. Whence that celebrating is not to be referred to the conception by reason of conception, but rather by reason of sanctification. So if St. Thomas knows, I can hear the objection already, if St. Thomas knows that it's immediately after animation, which is an affirmation, as we already talked about earlier, of the Immaculate Conception, if he knew this, why does he say it's unknown? Well, if you remember from almost the beginning of the stream, I made a side comment. This kind of side comment was to plant a little seed in your brain. The side comment was that the medievals were not exactly sure when animation happened. So it's not like conception. They know it's like 9 months before birth. They kind of know when that happens. They know when all these dates are, but they don't know an exact date, enough of an exact date to celebrate the date. Know when death happens, but there's not an exact date that they could put up for the celebration of the animation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or the sanctification of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So St. Thomas actually excuses them for this. And he says, well, since the animation's unknown, I guess the second best thing you to do is just celebrate the conception. That's kind of his reasoning for how it could be allowed. But St. Thomas still believes that it's immediately after the animation. He states it clearly right here. And then finishing off. Thus, therefore, it is not for this reason that the above-mentioned conception is to be celebrated, because she was conceived without original sin. It's not for that reason. For through this, it is not removed that she was prepared more specially than the rest, because in the sanctification itself, she received the gift of grace more copiously than the rest. Not only that she would be purged from original sin. Notice every time original sin is being used, it's being used for these fomus peccati, for this debitum culpae originalis, not for this actual contraction of original sin, because original sin, and this is like an easy way of proving this actually. Original sin, in the sense in which Ineffabilis Deus is talking about, in the sense in which we speak of in the Immaculate Conception, is something which inheres in the soul. It's very clear. Something which inheres in the soul. It's a privation of original justice in the soul. So can the body have original sin in that sense? No, of course not. It can't. But the fomus peccati is called original sin by way of extension. It's called original sin very frequently by all of the medievals. So you just have to know your terms. You have to know your terms. But so that her whole life would be rendered immune from every sin, mortal as well as venial, as Anselm says. Okay, so that is the very clear, very concise, I hope, demonstration of the affirmation by St. Thomas of the Immaculate Conception. So I don't see anything in the live chat. So as always, God bless.